Welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, the television show by businessmen, about business, for business. Just the other day, I was having a cup of coffee with an old friend of mine, Stephen Selwood. Now, anyone that works in the infrastructure business will know him and won't need much introduction. To let him tell you a story, I'd like to welcome somebody who's stood astride the infrastructure industry as no other, informing opinion and influencing views so that New Zealand can move about and get things done in a way that we can grow. So welcome Stephen Selwood.
Great to be here.
The Business at the Speed of Coffee. Now for Stephen, to our viewers, what do you mean by infrastructure?
Infrastructure, transportation, energy, telecommunications, social infrastructure, our schools, courts, housing, and all of those. And of course, water infrastructure to make sure that we're drinking safe water and we're adequately dealing with wastewater as well.
So all the stuff that sits in our economies to get things done and make us live.
We absolutely take for granted that it should be there and really object when it's not. It is fundamental to not only keeping our businesses evolving and growing and enabling growth, but it's also fundamental to our way of life and our standard of living. Infrastructure New Zealand was set up as the peak industry body about 14 years ago, and I was the initial CEO set to put the organisation in place. And much of that was about going and joining up corporate members as well as central government agencies and local government sector, who are all organisations motivated to make sure New Zealand has the right infrastructure in place. So we are now the peak infrastructure industry body in New Zealand. We do a lot of thought leadership, we do a lot of advocacy through to government, but founded on really substantive research to make sure that we're providing the right advice.
What sort of members have you got at there?
Well, they range from the obvious ones like the construction companies and the design engineering companies, but also the major banks, equity investors who want to invest in infrastructure as well, and then all of the professional advisory, whether it be financial, legal, or engineering services wrapped around that. And then local government sector, there's a strong representation there, and central government bodies as well as asset owners. So it's a very broad church.
Well, before we talk about the work of Infrastructure New Zealand, I'd like to find out where it started for you. Was this something you always were interested in? I mean, did you play with diggers as a kid?
Well, I'm not an engineer, let's put that on the record from day one. But yes, I've always been interested. I guess my avenue or way into the industry was through the Automobile Association. Most of my career prior to starting with Infrastructure New Zealand was with the AA, and I provided business support services from breakdown service to travel to insurance, and towards the end of my time with AA, I became the General Manager of Transport Policy. So that was the entree in, and I was actually, it was Employers and Manufacturers Association who rang me up one day and said, Stephen, I know you're thinking about moving on from the AA. We've got a job in infrastructure, you might be interested. And that's how the position came about.
Right. So, and it was like minds getting together.
Yes, it was.
And you recall the genesis of that was something of a crisis around Auckland, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking early 2000s here. Yeah. So, we just suffered power blackouts across the city. Many Aucklanders will recall that. Our water and sewage and discharges into the sea were unsatisfactory, and that's kind of a nationwide problem. But most importantly, our transportation system, just grinding to a halt. And sadly, it has improved marginally, but we've got a long way to go.
I can remember, 35 years ago, we'd really stopped building any major infrastructure roads.
Yeah.
I mean, the Clyde High Dam was the last thing I can remember that we did, and I also remember that even though we were paying a lot of petrol tax, the money wasn't ending up on the roads, was it?
Yeah, absolutely right. Look, I think there was a bit of a reaction late 80s, early 90s to the Rob Muldoon Think Big projects, and you'll remember all of the campaigns back in the day, Dam the Dams, and all of that sort of thing. And so there was a concern that we were over-investing in infrastructure, and some of those investments were questionable. Actually, as time and history has proved, they've been proven to be actually pretty good. In fact, most of our sustainable renewable electricity supply is the legacy of that investment period. But we kind of reacted, and we brought in the Resource Management Act, the planning laws effectively to make sure that we were making wise decisions from an environmental perspective. We changed the structure and form of local government and how they were funded, but much of those decisions effectively put a handbrake on investment. And we're paying the legacy of that underinvestment today.
There's a backstory I don't think it's well understood, of course, that during this period there was a period of low and no population growth.
True.
So I guess politicians kind of got off lightly because we probably didn't need all this stuff because they said, well, there's no more people. And then, you know, after the recession, the population started growing quite rapidly, and I don't think we had the systems in place to be able to compensate. So let's fast forward. We underinvested infrastructure for a very long time. Now, would you say there's an infrastructure deficit?
Oh, there still is a legacy deficit from that period of underinvestment.
Yeah.
I mean, it was decades of underinvestment. Yeah. But also, of course, we're now facing enormous growth, particularly in cities, not only in Auckland, but in the Bay of Plenty, in the Waikato, in Queenstown, Nelson, Tasman, right in Wellington, right across the whole country. And so we've got the growth problem as well as the legacy underinvestment problem, and we need to desperately put the hammer down.
Well, Steve, what about getting things done? I mean, when we look, there's been arguments in Auckland about whether we should toll the roads. We can see the tensions now with Auckland Transport, with the St Heliers residents. Everywhere you look, there seem to be underlying, in fact, quite a lot of anger.
Yes.
What do you think is at the core of all this?
Well, look, to me, it's actually the real root cause of our problems is our planning, governance and funding system. So when I talk about that, I mean, the Resource Management Act was actually intended to enable market investment. So the way that it works, it basically says you can invest in the social and economic development of your country provided you mitigate the environmental effects. Yeah, that was kind of quite a good sort of concept. But the problem was that we focused on all of the negative effects and we forgot about the positive reason why we're investing in the first place. And so everything is a battle. It's a battle of NIMBYs fighting against the effect of someone wanting to invest in a transportation or even a house next door to them. It's finding all the reasons why not rather than having a proactive planning system.
It's been a bonanza for the lawyers, hasn't it?
They love it. And yes, they're doing very well. But equally, even today, lawyers are now saying this system isn't working anymore.
What
it's
about
not
the
delivering for New
environmentalists?
Zealand.
How do they feel about it?
Well, from an environmental perspective, all of our indicators are going backwards. So biodiversity, air pollution, water pollution, all of the standards.
Cleanliness of the rivers.
The quality of our rivers is fundamental. Yes, we accept it as a kind of New Zealand right, but the reality is it's all going backwards. We've got to have the right structures in place. So local government has to be of the right scale and competence and capability to be able to deliver on the infrastructure needed to enable growth. And in fact, in many parts of New Zealand to support and retain the existing population bases they have. But they also have to be funded the right way. And currently all of the funding, all of the dividends from investment either go to the businesses who are investing, and let's hope that they do, or to central government through income tax or company tax or GST. Whereas all of the local government sector, they just have to pay for the infrastructure, but they've got no funding in recognition for that.
Interestingly, there doesn't seem to be a shortage of money to invest. Not so long ago I had Sam Stubbs, from Simplicity, and he said, well, look, there's capital that wants to invest in this stuff, but then we don't seem to make it easzy for them.
No,
Is that
we
right?
don't. Look, we need a clear pipeline of projects, investable projects that KiwiSaver or income superannuation, all the funds can invest in, and we're not proficient as a country bringing those projects to the market. We've just been on a delegation internationally looking at what other countries are doing, and probably exemplar is Singapore, Hong Kong, and indeed China. And so what they're doing is they're using publicly owned land, and in most cases they own the land in the first place, but they're acquiring land at scale, rezoning it for development, and then capturing the value from rezoning and investing in the infrastructure that releases and opens up the land, capturing the value from that, and funding affordable housing and transportation.
In London they've done that with a new tube, haven't they?
Yeah, the Cross-City Tunnel is modelled on that sort of approach, and in that case they used the business sector as being the leader of the voice for change, and I would certainly encourage.
But that was an opportunity that we've missed completely here in Auckland.
Well, we have sadly with the Central Rail Link.
And we're about to do the same thing with the tram to the airport.
Well, we may well do with light rail. That's the lesson out of CRL. For goodness sake, if we're going to be investing in a transportation system like heavy or light rail, then we should be capturing the land value on the stations adjacent to those corridors and leveraging growth off that. case of the CRL, we made a decision based on transportation alone, and we didn't think how we could leverage the land value around the stations.
Yes.
So you and I as taxpayers are paying for it.
Can we talk a little bit about the time? You know, the Resource Management Act and all of the delays that go with it. The Land Transport Management Act, I think, is another one that sits there. What do you have to say about that?
Well, look, under the planning system in the RMA, all of the district councils, including Auckland Council, are required to come up with a plan for how they're going to grow their city.
Yeah.
District plan, it's its official title. And so they make decisions about where growth can go, and they say, oh, we'll zone this land for development, but we won't zone that for development. And the theory is the market's going to come along, invest in the land, and everything will be hunky-dory. But in order for the market to invest, they have to be confident that there's going to be the infrastructure there, that it's going to be marketable land, and all of those sorts of things. And the decisions about, say, in Auckland's case, where the transportation is going to be delivered, those decisions are made under the Land Transport Management Act and the Local Government Act. Now, they work in different decision-making cycles. They may or may not be in sync, and usually aren't, with the decisions made under the RMA. So consequently, and we see it in all of our growth cities across New Zealand, where councils have enabled growth, but they haven't got a hope in heck of funding the infrastructure necessary to release the land.
Roads.
And consequently, we end up with congestion. So the root cause of our problems is this misalignment of our planning and investment system.
Well, I mean, so what is the answer?
Well, I think it's time for first principles reform of our planning systems, but also how we fund and structure local government as well. If we had all of those things lined up, then we could really make a difference.
Has the community generally understood and accepted this, do you think?
I don't think the community are just utterly frustrated at the time and delay and the impact it's having on their daily lives. But they don't really understand the fundamental drivers of it. Yeah. And we still, I think, in New Zealand have this belief that the RMA is about delivering great environmental outcomes, and of course we all want that as a nation. And so we're a bit reluctant to admit that actually it's not delivering those solutions. So until we grasp that nettle, we're really going to struggle to deliver the livability and the affordability that we as a country need.
Well, it just seemed to me that every time something big has to be done, the government has to pass special legislation. We saw that with with the tunnel through Waterview.
Yeah.
We've seen it pretty much with every other large piece of infrastructure in the last 20 years. And it seems to me the legislation can't be right if you have to have special government intervention every time you want to do something.
Precisely. I mean, the government right now is reforming the legislation again. You know, it's been in place for about 25 years. It's been reformed every year, and it's still not right. And so until we actually, have the courage to admit that the planning system is not delivering for us, then, we're going to struggle. And I think this constant tinkering with the legislation is not the answer. What we need is a bipartisan approach to this problem, because it's easy for an opposition to play politics and game the system, but that is very short-term thinking, and in the infrastructure world you've got to be thinking long-term transformation.
I think we need to also raise the quality of our political narratives. You and I were involved a while ago, and we saw the announcement of what was called ATAP at the time.
Yes.
Remember that Auckland Transport Alignment program? And I think there were 10 initiatives in there. Can you name me one that they've dug a hole yet?
Yeah, no. And the reality is that we keep on getting the promises from these various processes. I don't know how many times I've heard our mayor, not necessarily just the current one, or our politician saying this is the plan we need for Auckland and it's going to, finally fix things. The latest plan is $28 billion, that's a B, billion dollars worth of investment over 10 years, $2.8 billion a year. But all of the modelling shows that actually, notwithstanding that, we're going to go backwards. So that tells you we've not got the plan right yet.
No.
And the frustrating thing is that we keep on relitigating the plans rather than taking the tough decisions.
Trying to get to the North Shore is another one. I mean, what...
Harbour Crossing, that's been on the Never plan.
Is that
currently
necessary?
It's going to be, if the more we allow growth to the north, which is what the current unitary plan allows, the more pressure is going to go on that harbour crossing. So under the current plan, it's critical. On the other hand, if we were to grow more to the south and do scale development in the south, and this is where the Asian model of actually acquiring the land at rural land prices, so I'm talking to
and not
the
rezoning
government
for somebody else to make money out.
Exactly. The government and the council should buy that land, then realise the value themselves, and they can recycle that value back in affordable houses. That's what's going to make a difference. But it would also make a big difference to transportation, because we can defer, or at least won't have to rush into a harbour crossing, because more of the growth is to the south than to the north.
To enable that will require quite a different mindset, some legislative changes, I imagine.
Yes.
And a different view of the way government and local government operate, I would have thought.
Look, it needs to be a partnership between central and local government. Yes, we also need to acknowledge that our current plans are not delivering the outcomes that we want. So therefore we have to change them. But let's not completely relitigate everything all over. We know what the answers are, but we have to really grasp and make the hard decisions. To me, that's the bottom line.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of challenges here. And, where do we start? I mean, my view for some time has been that we need to get the planning systems fixed. Is there any hope of that happening?
Well, you should always start with where you want to get to. Have a very clear objective of the outcome that you want. And what we want is a livable city that we can get around and enjoy all of the amenities that New Zealand provides. So that's the outcome that we want. What's holding us back? Well, we're not investing in a timely way in infrastructure. Why is that? Because we haven't got enough money. How can we get the money? So we have to have a much more can-do approach to realising our objectives.
So the governance systems that sit under that are important as far as money is concerned.
So there are kind of 5 key things I would argue that we have to have. First, we've got to have clear vision about what we're about. What are we trying to achieve and why? And is there a decision-making governance system able to deliver that? Can we make decisions in a timely way? Second, we've got to have the long-term plan. So we're thinking long-term, not just in 3-year political election cycles, which are part of the root problem. Third is you've got to have the money. If you've got a plan, you've got to have the money to invest in it. So that means those 4 key funding mechanisms I spoke about before. Fourth, you've got to have a planning system that actually works and enables, not frustrates. So that's why we've got to look at our planning and our legal framework. And last year, I've got to have the delivery capability. So that's institutions within local government that have the skill and capability and scale to be able to implement, but also in the supply industry, confidence about what the long-term pipeline is, so that they will invest in people's skills.
They're going broke.
Yeah, well,
what's going on here? We've got the biggest construction boom in the history of the country, and they're all gone broke.
Yeah, because there is there's a lack of certainty about what their future investment pipeline is. We go from boom-bust cycles. So if you're in a construction business, what do you do? If your long-term horizon looks pretty risky, you invest short-term. You bring in subcontractors who may or may not have the capability that you need, but the advantage is you can flick them off if demand's not strong enough. And so we've got a construction industry that is geared around short-termism. They're not investing in training, they're not investing in capital, they're not investing in innovation. Yeah. And so for all of those reasons, when the pressure comes on and there's a whole bunch of work, they're scrambling around to get their market share, they're bidding low prices to pick them up, bringing in all the subcontractors, and suddenly find that their cost base is different to what they expected, and suddenly their profit margins are no longer there. And that's exactly what's happened in the construction sector over the last 2 to 3 years in New Zealand. And the answer to it is providing much greater clarity about what the long-term investment program is, so that the sector will invest in itself to have the capacity.
Stephen, is the industry itself advocating that view?
The industry has been long advocating that view.
Okay.
Sadly, the political horizon in our short-term 3-year election cycle means that we have major shifts in public policy. We absolutely need to invest in public transport. But to do that, they've turned off all of the roading projects, which the industry was geared up to provide. And so consequently, we've got a whole industry now sitting around waiting for the next public transport investment program to get on with, and they're not up to the start line yet because of their lack of funding. And if you have the capacity, if you have the certainty, then industry will build that capacity in the right sphere. But constant lurching from right to left is just problematic.
Have you got any inside knowledge for our viewers about this light rail that we're talking about going to the airport with and up west?
Do you know, if you had a really well-developed urban development strategy that enabled high density, targeted living beside the railway stations along the route, so that key workers who either worked in the city or at the airport at the other end of the line could live and use that corridor as the transportation mode, it may well stack up. My concern right now is it's being perceived as by many, in fairness, not by the government, but by many as a fast way to get from the city to the airport.
No, well, it's not that.
And the government rightly says it's an urban development project. But my question to the government is, where's your urban development plan that
behind
goes with the corridor? And it's a little bit like the CRL. We're thinking about it purely as a transportation investment, and we're not thinking about the urban growth strategy that supports it.
Stephen, it's every government, as they come in, it's their prerogative to have new looks of thing. And we know that this Labour coalition moved away from the roads of national significance and has gone to a safety sort of story. But it does seem to have produced some odd, like the Wellsford Road. Can you tell us a little bit how this... is there real common sense in that? I mean, or should we really advocating for perhaps mitigating the worst instincts there?
Well, look, I think the government made a political commitment to invest in public transport and road safety in the regions, and look, those are logical. That's a logical.
I think most people get that.
The question is that we're constantly robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah.
So the problem with our transportation funding system is it's just simply not adequate to both catch up with the legacy of underinvestment and cope with future growth. So this is where the role of private capital could make a material difference. The government has only got a certain amount of money to go around. It's made a political decision that it will invest in public transport and mitigate the worst of the safety features on the road safety system, particularly the state highway and rural road network. Now the reality is we need to be investing in much better roads, because at the end of the day, if the road environment is not safe with more and more traffic on it, you're inevitably going to increase the road safety risk, and we can see that happening on a daily basis.
Well, those terrible accidents down the line, if they'd been on a freeway, it's highly unlikely that would have happened.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, the curve would have been softer, and even if they'd made a mistake, they would have been captured by a dividing barrier or at the side, and it would have been a much more forgiving road environment. So we need to invest in our quality roads. There are funds, be they iwi, superannuation, KiwiSaver, international capital funds, the like, who are looking for opportunities to invest in infrastructure. Why on earth don't we let them? So that the public money could go into the public good projects, i.e. the public transport projects, and the private capital can go into the roading projects that produce an economic return. Tolling will enable the funding to repay that debt, supported by road pricing. We could have both if we chose to. The fact that we can't even synchronise our traffic lights in Auckland, for example, in fact, in New Zealand, I don't know, it seems to be beyond us for some reason.
But another country?
I know, this is kind of, we're talking about driverless cars in one sense, and yet we can't even get the traffic lights synchronised. So there's some pretty basic stuff there. Yeah. But the most important thing that we need to do is we have to grasp the nettle on pricing our transportation system. So look, we've been a long advocate of having road pricing in place on the Auckland motorway network. It will be a dynamic tolling system. So as soon as demand starts creeping up and congestion's getting worse, the price goes up, and would send direct signals to road users. Now's not the time to get on the motorway. Try and rephase.
Does this affect poor people though?
Well, the beauty of it is that if it's the behaviour of the motorists themselves that determine the price. So if the price willingness to pay or ability to pay is very low, then the toll will be very low as well. But if people are so desperate to use the system that they keep on bidding up the price by their own behaviour, then the price will be high.
But why have we only got one driver in a car going down the freeway?
Well, partly because of these incentives. There's many Aucklanders who choose, just because they can, to travel at peak by themselves, to go and visit someone or go to the shops. Because they've got all the time in the world, they don't really care. And so that's clogging up the motorway system at the very time when we want business and productivity to be able to get around the city. And so the pricing mechanism, if it changes, will send signals to those people, well, you don't really have to travel at 8 o'clock to go and visit art, whatever. Do that at 10 a.m. when the traffic
Where else in the world do they do that?
Oh, there's a few cities that have introduced it. The smartest in the world to date is Singapore. They've had a variable toll system in place for a long time now, and they're just about to go to full global positioning. So you have a device in your car, and depending on where you are, you'll get priced. We don't have to be that sophisticated, probably too soon. The London Cordon toll is another example. Stockholm's another city that's put it in place. Gothenburg now in Sweden. But if we were to price our motorway system, two things would happen. One is that we'd be able to manage demand much more effectively for the reasons I just explained. The other is 1 million cars a day join the Auckland motorway system on all the on-ramps. So imagine if on average they paid a couple of bucks, right? Yeah. It's $2 million a day.
That we don't currently
get. 700 million bucks a year. There'll be a bit of it, So let's say, given the demand effect, it might be 500 million a year. That's a lot of money to now invest in a transportation system that can transform Auckland. And effectively, we've got a choice. We either keep on doing what we're doing, and clearly that's not working, or we actually grasp the needle and take the decisions that we need to take to make a difference.
What do you say to the green voter who says, well, no roads, they're yesterday's solution, we can't build roads to our future? Is that realistic?
Look, business and the way that almost all New Zealanders earn their money depend on the mobility that roading provides. 90% of our movement in New Zealand is by road. We have to accept that fact. And in fact, vehicle kilometres travelled in New Zealand are going up by billions on an annual basis, notwithstanding the investment in public transport. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the Greens are wrong to be investing in public transport. They're absolutely right that we should be. But equally we need to be investing in a safer and more efficient roading system as well. And that's where we can leverage private capital and the other funding mechanisms that we spoke about to enable that investment to occur.
Well, it's not an accident, pardon the pun, but the one road that there's no accidents on is the one road that's built to international standards, and that's the extension of the road up to Puhoi. Is that right?
That's correct. The safety record of that road prior to the motorway being put in place was atrocious. Same with the Waikato Expressway, and we can see it on State Highway 2 down to the busy Tauranga Bay of Plenty. You know, the accident risks on that state highway are atrocious. State Highway 1 north of Warkworth will be the same. We'll have a high quality road to Warkworth and then people will start killing themselves. So, you know, we've got to have the right infrastructure in to create a safe environment for people to get around and for businesses to do their business.
Do you want to enter this discussion about whether the port should stay here in Auckland?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really important discussion. It's not an easy one, you know, because on the one hand, you know, Auckland city centre could be a fantastic amenity, fantastic opportunity to access the waterfront. But to me, you know, we've got a tremendous opportunity in the Wynyard Quarter section of Auckland, and we've already seen the advantages of investment and turning that into a people place. But we've got a long way to go with that before we need to start arguing about, my view, about the location of the port. That is my own personal view. I think the port is likely to stay here for quite some considerable time yet. I think much of Auckland's economy and our quality of living depends on our accessibility to the port. I do think it needs to constrain its footprint on the existing land. Clearly that's its social licence to operate. So the question is, how can we win the best of both worlds? Keep the port but enable a vibrant waterfront. And I think development of the Wynyard Quarter, including the Silo Park, currently out on that peninsula, and then keep the port, let it improve its productivity through technology and making sure that it is keeping within its existing footprint, and we can in fact have the best of both worlds here.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, Stephen, thank you for your leadership of the industry. I know that Stephen has been working hard for a long time, particularly with the environmentalists, with Gary Taylor and the Property Council, and the MA to try and get these planning systems more effective for the future. And as you can see, there is a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge in infrastructure in New Zealand. And so, Stephen Selwood, thank you for being on Business at the Speed of Coffee.
Thank you, Kim.